Dear imprisoned father and supporters, my name is Linda Blade. I am a sport performance coach with a PhD in a branch of human biology called kinesiology, and I currently serve as elected president of Athletics Alberta. Like any decent Canadian, I am astonished and outraged at what is happening in Canada. Somehow this country has descended into an abyss of absurdity where our famed kindness is now manifested in laws that are used by the leadership class to diminish the importance of biological sex in all aspects of life. Despite the explicit mention of biological sex as a characteristic worthy of protection under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, more recent human rights legislation across the land has been framed in such a way as to replace it with ill-defined, quote, gender identity. In 2016, a bait-and-switch trick happened right before our very eyes in Parliament. Upon first reading of Bill C-16, members of Parliament went to great lengths to emphasize that biological sex and gender identity were two distinct things of equal importance. MP Michelle Rempel's justification for her support of Bill C-16 included the following quote to clarify the distinction. Quote, gender describes the characteristics that a society or culture delineates as masculine or feminine. So while your sex as a male or female is a biological fact that is the same in any culture, what that sex means in terms of your gender role in society can be quite different cross-culturally. These gender roles have an impact on the health of an individual. In sociological terms, gender role refers to the characteristics and behaviors that different cultures attribute to the sexes, unquote. In hindsight, it was a grand deception. As soon as Bill C-16 became law, gender identity quickly eclipsed biological sex as the characteristic deserving of exclusive protection. Indeed, in many contexts of Canadian life, the mere mention of biological sex that was stated as a given fact during the C-16 debate in Parliament and continues to be protected under the Charter is now frequently judged to be hateful. How in the world did this happen? We are seeing the enormous consequences of this deception. To not acknowledge biological sex as a material reality results in male rapists being placed in women's prisons, male bodies being admitted into women's sports, and yes, children being convinced by the SOGI 123 curriculum in our schools and on social media that their future biological well-being means nothing. Gender identity is the shiny new dogma that seeks to devour and destroy young Canadian bodies on the altar of a temporary and fluid state of mind that is being incessantly promoted by adults who should know better. Parents and therapists alike are discouraged from exploring alternative options to the destructive affirmation of this deception. They are not allowed to consider the coexisting fact of biological sex and the permanent physical devastation that results from a child entering the medical pathway unnecessarily. It is critical to note that the famous detransitioned female in the UK, Keira Bell, has been calling for a different approach. In her blog on Wednesday of this very week, Keira expressed a wish for a therapeutic strategy that is exactly the opposite of what is being promoted here in Canada. She said, quote, it was the job of professionals to consider all of my comorbidities, not just to affirm my naive hope that everything could be solved with hormones and surgery, unquote. When Keira was 16 years of age, she was a troubled young person looking for help. Following the same policies being promoted in Canada, medical professionals in the UK led Keira to believe that medical transition would help. Step 1 was puberty blockers. Here is how Keira describes the effect of puberty blockers. Quote, the puberty blockers that I received at 16 were designed to stop my sexual maturation. The idea was that this would give me a, quote, pause to think about whether I wanted to continue to a further gender transition. This so-called pause put me into what felt like menopause, with hot flashes, night sweats, and brain fog. All this made it more difficult to think clearly and about what I should do. By the end of a year of this treatment, when I was presented with the option of moving on to testosterone, I jumped at it. I wanted to feel like a young man, not an old woman," unquote. Well, of course, this is how it works on the Canadian pathway as well. Puberty blockers first, then the rush to wrong sex hormonal treatment and surgery. Step 2 was testosterone injections, and Step 3 was surgical removal of Kira's healthy breasts shortly thereafter. Here's how Kira describes those. Quote, "The consequences of what happened to me have been profound. Possible infertility, loss of my breasts and inability to breastfeed, atrophied genitals, a permanently changed voice, facial hair," unquote. Well into her 20s, Kira realized this had all been a big mistake. She took Tavistock Clinic to court, and the 3 UK judges presiding over the case unanimously ruled in her favor. And finally, here is how Kira describes the situation, which, remember, is exactly the same situation that pertains to this imprisoned father's child here in British Columbia. Quote, "As the High Court found, much of the clinic's treatment is not even based on solid evidence. At the time our case was accepted, the NHS, National Health Service, was asserting that the effects of puberty blockers are, quote, fully reversible. But recently, the NHS reversed itself, acknowledging that little is known about the long-term side effects on a teenager's body and brain. That didn't stop them from prescribing these drugs to people like me," unquote. In other words, the medical community in the UK is being forced to acknowledge that this treatment regime is entirely experimental. What the imprisoned father has been asking for on behalf of his dear child here in British Columbia is nothing more than any of us would request. Consideration of all the possible sources of the teen's troubles, and most importantly, time. Time for his child to consider the permanent physical consequences of medical interference in the midst of a critical phase of biological growth and development. Friends and colleagues, it is sad to say that our social and political leaders in Canada have utterly failed to deliver the balanced treatment implied back in 2016 and 17. Bills C-16 and now C-6 both represent a catastrophe in the making. Canadians will be mourning the many young lives sacrificed at the behest of this deceptive ideology, and we will likely be paying reparations for decades to come. It is time to stop. Please stop this madness. Let's fix the disastrous legislation before it's too late. Let's either repeal these bills or add special exemptions that enable us to regain the balanced treatment of gender identity and biological sex that were both highlighted in Parliament only a few years ago. And for goodness sake, please free the imprisoned father. This immense injustice should have no place in the land of the true North, strong and free. Thank you for allowing me to speak today.